The air inside the conference room felt thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Generals and high-ranking officers filled the seats, a horseshoe around the central table, each one wearing the weight of their rank like a mantle. Lieutenant Commander Ben Maddox stood at the far end, her posture rigid but unassuming. The polished surface of the table reflected the solemnity of the moment, a moment that had been building for years but was now about to unfold before the eyes of the highest military command. Today's session was not just another routine briefing. It was a test, not of her skills in combat, but of her integrity. The air hummed with expectation. General Hull leaned forward, his posture radiating authority as he locked eyes with Maddox. The words that followed were sharp, cutting through the air. "You're listed here as a field evaluator, not an operator, correct?" His voice was calm, almost rehearsed, but the undertone of challenge was unmistakable. "I serve as both, sir. Operationally embedded advisory track," Maddox replied, her voice steady, unwavering. She had been through worse. She would endure this too. But then the question came, laced with skepticism. "How many targets have you neutralized directly?" The room went still. Maddox didn't flinch. She met his gaze with the same unwavering calm. 61 across 5 regions over a 12-year span, she stated, her voice clear, unshaken. The number hung in the air, heavy with the weight of its truth. General Markham's laughter was a low, dismissive sound, laced with venom. "That's a lie," he declared, as if it were a simple fact. The room froze. The silence was oppressive, thick with tension. Maddox remained unmoved, her face expressionless, her hands resting calmly in front of her. The truth, she knew, was not something they were prepared to accept, but she had nothing to prove. She only needed to be silent. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. General Hull's smirk faltered for just a moment, but then it returned, mocking. "Let's slow this down," he said, his voice oozing condescension, "because numbers like that don't come out of nowhere." Maddox did not respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was the answer they refused to hear. But then came the slap. It wasn't a grand gesture, no dramatic build-up. It was just the sharp crack of skin against skin. A slap, not for effect, but to assert control. The room held its breath, every eye fixed on Maddox. But she did not move. Her jaw shifted slightly with the force of the strike, but that was all. She didn't blink, didn't recoil. Her gaze remained steady, unwavering. She reached up, touched her jaw for a moment, and then lowered her hand. The sound of the slap was still ringing in the air as she spoke. "Session concluded. I'll log a summary for Joint Command." And then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room. There was no protest, no outburst. Just the quiet dignity of a woman who had been tested and found herself unbroken. The door clicked shut behind her, its sound final, as if the moment had already been sealed. Inside the room, there was no satisfaction, no smug victory, just the cold realization that they had made a grave miscalculation. The rest of the world would never know what had truly happened in that room, but those who mattered would, and they would not forget. The silence of the hallway outside the conference room was almost a relief after the tension of the briefing. Lieutenant Commander Ben Maddox walked down the corridor with deliberate steps, her boots echoing softly on the polished floor. Her face was calm, impassive. But inside, something shifted. She had expected this. She had known the weight of her service record would be questioned, but never had she anticipated such blatant disrespect. The slap had been a moment of humiliation, but it had not broken her. It had only reinforced her resolve. Maddox reached the operations desk and signed the necessary paperwork, requesting a combat evaluation slot for later that night. She could hear the hushed whispers of the staff around her, but she paid them no mind. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back. Meanwhile, inside the command room, The generals and officers were still reeling from the scene that had unfolded. General Hull paced the room, his face flushed with frustration. He had struck her, but it hadn't brought the desired result. She hadn't reacted in anger, hadn't shown any weakness. It had been a mistake, one he was too proud to acknowledge. Markham leaned against the table, arms folded across his chest. "She didn't flinch," he muttered. "Didn't even blink." The words were a sharp reminder of the control Maddox had maintained, the quiet strength that no slap, no insult could erode. Markham snorted. "We've seen people crumble under less." Hall's eyes narrowed. "We need to break her, make her doubt herself. This isn't over." Markham didn't respond. The sound of Maddox's name on his lips felt hollow, a reminder of how badly things had gone awry. Meanwhile, in the admin office, Captain Ronan Thier stood by the window, watching the officers pass by. He had witnessed everything, had seen the slap, and yet he knew better than to jump to conclusions. Maddox had walked away, yes, but that did not mean the story was finished. The truth was never as clear-cut as it seemed. The generals may have struck her down in that room, but they had no idea what she was capable of. Thier had been in the Navy long enough to understand the quiet strength of someone like Maddox. She wasn't the type to seek revenge or validation. She was the type to let her actions speak louder than any words, and tonight she was about to show them just how loud silence could be. At the same time, rumors were already spreading through the base. Officers gathered in groups, speculating about the events that had transpired. Some claimed Maddox had crumbled, others whispered that she had been frozen in shock, but none of them knew the truth. They didn't understand that the slap had not been her defeat, but her awakening. She wasn't going to let them control the narrative. As the evening shadows grew long and the base began to settle into its nighttime rhythm, Maddox prepared for the next phase. She knew the generals would show up, expecting some sort of spectacle, some grand performance that would confirm their assumptions. But they wouldn't get that. What they would get was the truth. Not a lie, not a myth, but the quiet, undeniable truth of her actions, her discipline, and her resolve. The game was far from over, and tonight Maddox would show them how silence could be the most powerful weapon of all. The control room buzzed with anticipation as the doors to Facility 12 Bravo opened. Maddox entered alone, no fanfare, no witnesses. She was ready. She signed in, confirmed her slot, and began the first part of the evaluation. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. She was here to show them the truth of who she was. And the truth, as she knew, was always the most dangerous weapon in the room. The lights flickered above her, casting long shadows across the cold concrete floor. It felt like everything was aligned. The training grid lit up, the fog machines whirred to life, and the simulation began. But this wasn't just another drill. This was her moment of reckoning. And tonight, General Hull and General Markham would finally understand what it meant to face the truth. Inside the control room, the hum of machines faded into the background as Captain Ronan Thier observed the scene through the glass. He had seen his fair share of operations, but this felt different. Maddox was no longer the woman who had been disrespected in the conference room. She was a force unto herself, a quiet storm waiting to be unleashed. As she stood in the middle of Facility 12 Bravo, her stance was calm, controlled, every movement precise. The fog began to fill the space, swirling around her feet, narrowing her vision to only a few feet ahead. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath. General Hull and General Markham walked in shortly after, their usual smugness still hanging over them like a cloak. They had expected a show, something that would reaffirm their sense of control. Instead, they were about to face something far more dangerous. Discipline. "What's the first task?" Hull asked, his voice a bit too loud for comfort. "Pressure adaptive maneuvering under simulated fog of war conditions," Maddox replied, her voice low and calm, yet carrying the weight of someone who had seen and lived through more than they ever would. Markham chuckled, the sound hollow. "Another obstacle course?" he sneered. "If you want to see something impressive, I suggest you take notes." The air between them was thick with tension, but Maddox did not rise to the bait. She merely nodded, stepping into position. The exercise began with a quiet beep, signaling the start of the scenario. Hall and Markham stood at the far end, clearly underestimating her ability to perform under pressure. The training grid shifted, and Maddox immediately reacted. Her body moved fluidly, instinctively, as if this was just another day in the field. Markham, eager to make a point, stepped forward first, ready to face her. But before he even had time to react, Maddox was on him, a blur of motion faster than he could process. Her forearm redirected his rifle, and in one swift move she had him pinned, her elbow across his throat. He hit the mat with a muffled thud, the sound drowned out by the hiss of fog filling the room. Hall stood there, frozen for a moment, disbelief etched across his face. Maddox didn't even look at him. She was already turning toward her next target. Hall scrambled to react, but Maddox was already behind him. She moved in close, her body weight shifting just enough to bring him down in a controlled slide. His rifle didn't even have time to rise before she had him on the ground, her hand pressing into his jaw, locking him in place. He had barely any time to register what had happened before the infrared sensor tagged him as neutralized. The room fell silent. Markham groaned from the floor, still trying to process the speed and precision of the attack. "This is a stunt," he said, though his voice lacked its usual arrogance. "No," Maddox replied, her voice steady. "It's an answer." She stood, not out of breath, not fatigued. She was calm, collected. The performance was over. She had made her point. But Hall wasn't ready to concede. "That's not how this works," he muttered, pushing himself up off the mat. "You think you've won? This isn't a game." Maddox didn't respond. She wasn't here for their approval. She was here to show them what she was capable of. And that was all. She turned toward the exit, her movement slow but deliberate. As she walked past Hall and Markham, she glanced back only once, her gaze cool and unfaltering. "You asked what makes someone a SEAL," she said, her voice low but clear. "You just saw it." And then, without another word, she left. The door clicked behind her, its sound sharp and final. Inside the room, Hall and Markham were left in stunned silence. There were no words, no triumphant declarations. Only the quiet realization that they had just witnessed something far more powerful than they had bargained for. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no going back. In the observation tower, Captain Thier watched quietly, his expression unreadable. He had known Maddox would not disappoint. He had known, even before she had entered the room, that she would not be the one to back down. And now, the generals were the ones who had to face the consequences of their actions. But as he watched her leave, he couldn't help but wonder, had they truly learned their lesson? Or had they only just begun to understand what it meant to face a woman like Maddox? He didn't know. But the day's events would echo in their careers for a long time to come. And for Maddox, it was just another day in the field. The following morning, the buzz around the base was palpable. Rumors were already circulating about the previous night's events, but the truth was more complicated than any of them knew. Generals Hull and Markham had returned to their offices, but neither spoke of the demonstration. The slap, the claims of lies, the accusations, none of it was acknowledged. Instead, there was only a chilling silence. A silence that could mean one of two things. Either they were too proud to admit defeat, or they were too shaken to know how to respond. In the quiet of their respective offices, Hall and Markham sat, surrounded by the weight of their decisions, each feeling the uncomfortable shift in the atmosphere around them. They had never expected Maddox to challenge them the way she had. They had expected her to buckle under pressure, to falter in the face of their authority. But instead, she had stood firm, unyielding. It was a humbling reminder of just how little they truly understood her. For Captain Thier, the aftermath was just as quiet, but the sense of impending change was inescapable. He had seen how things worked at Quantico, how power was often a matter of perception, how respect was gained through more than just rank. But what had happened the night before was different. It had been a moment of clarity, of truth, and it had been witnessed by everyone in that room. Thier knew that the general's authority would never fully recover from what had transpired. In the days that followed, the tension between Maddox and the two generals simmered under the surface, but it never boiled over. No more slaps, no more public outbursts. Instead, there was something subtler, something more dangerous, a quiet determination that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Maddox herself didn't speak much to anyone. She kept to her routines, her duties. Her actions, however, spoke louder than any words. The generals, now on edge, began to avoid her whenever possible, their exchanges with her becoming terse and professional. But every time they looked her way, they couldn't escape the memory of her calm, her composure, her absolute control in the face of their aggression. It was as if they had inadvertently given her a silent victory. A victory she hadn't sought, but had earned nonetheless. As for Maddox, the sense of victory was not in the defeat of her superiors, but in the preservation of her own integrity. She had proven herself, not to them, not to anyone, but to herself. She had stood in the face of injustice and remained unbroken. For her, that was all that mattered. Meanwhile, the internal investigations into the incident began in earnest. Though there were no public reports yet, the wheels of military bureaucracy were already turning. The video footage of the slap had been forwarded to the appropriate channels, reviewed, and discussed. Hall and Markham were not unaware of the impending consequences. They knew that what had happened behind closed doors would not remain hidden forever. As the days passed, Maddox remained a figure of quiet strength within the base. Her colleagues whispered about her, unsure whether to commend her or fear her. Some admired her silence, others resented it. But no one could deny that she had earned their respect. Even those who had once looked down on her now found themselves reconsidering their judgments. The chain of command had been shaken, and it wasn't clear who would come out on top. But one thing was certain: Maddox had changed the game. The generals, for all their authority, had failed to break her. They had tried to use their power to silence her, but in the end, it had been their own arrogance that had undone them. As for Maddox, she had walked away from it all with the knowledge that she had never truly been the one in need of validation. The validation had always been in the record, and the record, as she had shown them, never lies. The weeks following the incident were marked by a quiet tension, one that permeated every corner of Quantico, but remained unspoken. For General Hull and General Markham, the fallout had been both swift and invisible. No public reprimands, no flashy headlines, just a series of formal inquiries and a steady stream of closed-door meetings. Their careers had not yet come to an official end, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Hull spent hours in his office, reviewing reports, trying to regain control over his reputation, his authority. But the weight of what had happened, the slap, the quiet defiance of Maddox, lingered in the air like smoke. He knew that the situation would not resolve itself on its own. He had made a mistake, one that could not be easily erased. Markham, too, had retreated into his own space, trying to maintain the facade of control, but the undercurrent of uncertainty was undeniable. Both men could feel the walls closing in around them, the inevitability of consequences growing clearer with each passing day. Meanwhile, Maddox had not wavered. She kept to herself, focusing on her duties, doing the work that had always defined her: operational evaluations, training exercises, and quiet, precise assessments. Her colleagues noticed her calm. They noticed the way she had carried herself after the events of that fateful day, how she seemed untouched by the drama that had consumed the base. Some, like Captain Thier, admired her quiet strength. Others, like the younger officers, were still too uncertain to know what to make of her. But what was clear to all was that Maddox had earned something no one could take away from her: respect. It wasn't the kind of respect that comes from rank or title, but from something deeper, something earned through consistency, discipline, and unflinching integrity. There was no spectacle, no dramatic confrontation. She had simply stood her ground, and in doing so had changed the narrative. As the internal investigations progressed, the general's positions grew more precarious. The footage of the slap was circulated among the high command, and though it remained classified, whispers of its content began to surface. It was only a matter of time before the truth, in its rawest form, would be exposed. Hall and Markham both knew that they could not control this story. They could no longer silence Maddox with their words, their authority. Her actions had done what words never could. They had redefined the power dynamic, and now the consequences were coming. In the midst of all this, Maddox remained focused on her mission. She had not sought revenge, had not allowed herself to be consumed by the drama. Instead, she had turned her attention to the work that had always mattered most to her, the work that would speak louder than any slap, any insult. She would let the record speak for itself. That was the only validation she needed. But as the days went by, the pressure on the generals mounted. Hall and Markham were summoned to an official hearing, not for their actions in the field, but for the conduct that had taken place in that closed-door meeting. Their careers hung in the balance, and they knew it, but for Maddox, the battle had already been won. The hearing, when it finally took place, was subdued. No grand speeches, no outbursts. Just a cold, clinical review of the events that had transpired. The evidence was clear, undeniable. The slap had been an act of aggression, unprovoked and unwarranted. And though Hall and Markham had tried to downplay it, their actions had been exposed for what they were, an abuse of power. The hearing concluded with a formal reprimand for both generals, their positions stripped, their names tarnished by the truth of what had happened. It was a quiet end, but an end nonetheless. No one celebrated, no one cheered. The only sound in the room was the quiet scratching of pens on paper, the finality of the decision marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For Maddox, the end had already come. She had walked away from the entire ordeal with nothing but her dignity intact. The respect she had earned, not through titles or accolades, but through her actions, was hers to keep. She was done with the games. She had never played them in the first place. As she walked out of the hearing room, the weight of the past few weeks lifted off her shoulders. She had fought her own battle, and she had won. It wasn't about the generals. It wasn't about revenge. It was about the truth. And the truth, as always, had a way of coming to light. The weeks that followed the hearing felt like a quiet reckoning for everyone involved. General Hall and General Markham were both officially removed from their roles in the Inter-Service Command, a consequence of their actions that no amount of political maneuvering could undo. They were still men of rank, still holding the title of general, but their influence had been shattered. What had once been an ironclad reputation now felt fragile, like a facade that could crumble at the slightest touch. Their names no longer carried the weight they once did. Even as they sat in their offices, surrounded by the trappings of authority, they couldn't escape the realization that they had lost the respect of those who mattered. Their authority had been tested, and they had failed. There was no dramatic fallout, no headlines, but there was something more insidious, an erosion of their status, a quiet, inexorable retreat into irrelevance. For Captain Thier, the changes were just as quiet, but equally significant. He had watched the entire ordeal unfold, had seen the consequences of the general's actions, and had come to a simple conclusion. The military was a place of power, but power was not something that could be wielded recklessly. He had seen the shift in the air after Maddox's demonstration, had watched her walk out of the training facility with a quiet dignity that had changed everything. There were no medals, no public accolades, but Thier knew better than most that true strength didn't require fanfare. It was in the moments when no one was watching, when the pressure of expectation was at its highest, that real character revealed itself. And Maddox had shown him exactly what that looked like. Maddox herself, however, had no interest in basking in the afterglow of her victory. She had no need for recognition, no desire for praise. Her actions spoke for themselves, and that was enough. She returned to her work, to the quiet rhythm of duty and discipline, the only things that had ever mattered to her. Her colleagues continued to talk about her, to whisper about the incident, but Maddox remained unaffected. She had proven her worth, not through words, but through her actions, and that was a truth no one could take away from her. The air at Quantico had changed, though no one could quite put their finger on what had shifted. There was a new understanding, an unspoken recognition of what had transpired. The younger officers who had once viewed Maddox with skepticism now looked at her with a mixture of admiration and respect. They had seen how she had handled herself under pressure, how she had remained steadfast even when the world seemed to be conspiring against her. It was a lesson they would carry with them, one that would shape their careers for years to come. The generals, on the other hand, were left to face the consequences of their actions. Hall and Markham's reputations were tarnished, their careers irreparably damaged by their behavior. There would be no public outcry, no grand scandal, but there was a quiet shift in the way they were viewed. They had failed the test, and the military, in its silent way, had held them accountable. For Maddox, it was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The battle had been fought, not in the public eye, but in the quiet spaces between duty and honor. She had not sought revenge, had not tried to prove a point. She had simply done what was right. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The echoes of the slap, the accusations, the power struggle, all of it faded into the background, replaced by the quiet certainty that truth, no matter how long it took, would always prevail. Maddox walked away from the ordeal not as a victim, not as a hero, but simply as herself, and that was more than enough. The air outside Quantico smelled different now, fresher, as if the storm had finally passed. Maddox walked through the gates of the base one last time, her steps steady and sure. She had faced the hardest test of her life, and she had come through it unbroken. And now she was free to move forward, to continue her work, to continue proving herself, not to anyone else, but to herself. The past was behind her, but the lessons learned would stay with her forever. In the weeks after the official review, Quantico settled into an uneasy calm. Life on base resumed its usual rhythm, but there was an unspoken shift in the air. The events surrounding Maddox, Hall, and Markham had cast a long shadow, and though the generals had been quietly removed from their positions, their influence still lingered in the whispers of those who had once followed them. Yet, for all the undercurrents of change, the military remained a place of order, where actions often spoke louder than words. And it was clear that Maddox had not only spoken, but had made her actions unforgettable. She continued her work, focusing on her mission without distraction. But now there was a deeper level of respect that followed her wherever she went. The junior officers who had once eyed her with suspicion now sought her counsel. The senior officers who had once dismissed her as an outsider now acknowledged her competence and discipline. Maddox's reputation had grown, not because of the incident, but because she had remained consistent in her duty, proving time and again that her actions were more powerful than any words could be. As for Captain Thier, he found himself reflecting on the subtle shift in the power dynamics at play. He had witnessed how quickly things could change, how a single moment of quiet defiance could change the course of someone's life. He had seen the generals' arrogance unravel, their once unshakable authority reduced to nothing more than a fragile shell. For Thier, the lesson was clear. Authority could be taken, but respect had to be earned. Maddox had earned it through her actions and her restraint. In the quiet of his office, Thier reviewed the logs of the incident once again. He had been a witness to the slap, but now, weeks later, he realized that the true significance of that moment wasn't in the aggression of the generals, but in Maddox's unflinching resolve. She had refused to break, had refused to be anything less than herself, even in the face of disrespect. The general's failure had become her quiet victory, but it was a victory that needed no announcement. It spoke for itself. At the same time, Hall and Markham continued their slow retreat from public life. They had not yet faced criminal charges, but the review board's findings had been enough to ensure their removal from inter-service duties. Their names, once associated with power and respect, were now whispered only in the shadows. They had been caught in a moment of weakness, and though they had tried to downplay it, the truth was undeniable. The military machine had turned its gaze upon them and found them wanting. Theirs was a story of pride, arrogance, and an eventual fall from grace, but there was no redemption for them in the public eye. Maddox, meanwhile, had stepped out of the limelight. She had not sought recognition, had not sought to claim a victory for herself. Instead, she continued with her work, her focus unwavering. The drama surrounding the generals had faded, and in its place, the quiet certainty of Maddox's presence had taken hold. She was no longer the outsider, the woman who had been underestimated. She had become a symbol of what it meant to stand firm in the face of adversity, to never back down, and to always, without hesitation, follow the path of integrity. The echoes of the past had faded, but the lessons lingered. It was a lesson in quiet strength, in the power of restraint, and in the unyielding certainty that the truth, no matter how long it takes, would always find its way to the surface. For Maddox, there was no need to prove herself any more. The truth was already written in the record, and that was all that mattered. The rest of the world could catch up, or it could continue to misunderstand. But in the end, she would always stand by the record. And that was enough. Months passed, and the story of General Hall, General Markham, and Lieutenant Commander Maddox became one of those whispered tales on base, the kind that would be passed down, not as history, but as a lesson. The military, as always, had moved on, continuing its operations and training exercises. But for those who had witnessed the events firsthand, nothing would ever be quite the same. Maddox, for her part, remained as she always had, focused, determined, and unwavering in her commitment to her work. She had earned the respect of her peers, but she was never one to revel in it. Her achievements, her success, and her dignity had always been rooted in the quiet, unspoken understanding that doing what was right was its own reward. Despite her unyielding resolve, she could feel the weight of the unspoken recognition that followed her. It was as if every officer, every colleague, and every superior had come to understand that there was a new standard to be upheld. Not a standard of rank, but of character. The lessons of the past, those taught by the quiet defiance of a woman standing up to power, had become an unspoken rule. The truth, once it was spoken, had to be respected. In the corridors of the command center, whispers still circled about what had happened. The general's downfall had not been dramatic or sensational. It had been quiet, clinical, and inevitable. They had failed, not just as commanders, but as men. They had underestimated Maddox and had paid the price. Their pride had led them to believe that their authority was absolute, that their position was invulnerable. But in the end, they had learned that true authority was earned, not dictated. Maddox, however, did not need to reflect on the events of that day. She had already moved on. She was never one to dwell on the past. The future, with all its uncertainties and challenges, was what mattered now. She remained focused on her work, the one thing that had always been her true calling. As for Hall and Markham, their careers were a thing of the past. They would fade into obscurity, their names forgotten by those who had once respected them. But that was the price of arrogance, of pride, and of not understanding the true meaning of power. Their careers had been destroyed not by an enemy, but by their own failings. In the end, it was Maddox who had walked away unscathed, not because she was invincible, but because she had never needed to be anything other than herself. For her, the victory had always been about the truth, not about revenge. It had been about standing firm in the face of falsehood and letting her actions speak for themselves. And as the days passed, Maddox's reputation continued to grow, not because she sought recognition, but because she had earned it, quietly and with dignity. The military had its rules, its hierarchies, and its codes. But what Maddox had shown was that the most important rule of all was to remain true to oneself. That was the lesson she had learned long ago, and it was the lesson that had carried her through everything. As she walked through the gates of Quantico, for what might be the last time, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The road ahead was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. The truth, no matter how long it took, would always have its day, and no one could take that away from her. As the seasons changed and the days at Quantico grew quieter, a shift began to take place within the walls of the military base. The story of the slap, the accusations, and the subsequent downfall of two generals was no longer the talk of the day. Yet its impact lingered, subtly woven into the fabric of the base's culture. The lessons of those events had settled deeply into the minds of the officers and soldiers who had witnessed them, even if they never spoke of it aloud. Maddox, for her part, did not bask in the attention, nor did she seek to revisit the past. She continued her duties, her work always her focus, always her priority. Her quiet presence was a reminder to all who crossed her path of what it meant to uphold one's values, even when the odds seemed impossible. The younger officers, many of whom had once viewed her with skepticism or outright indifference, now looked to her as a model of discipline and professionalism. They respected her not for the power she wielded, but for the consistency with which she lived by her principles. She did not need to prove herself to them. They had already seen what she was capable of, and for them, that was enough. In the background, Captain Thayer continued his observations, his perspective shaped by the events that had unfolded. He had seen firsthand the vulnerability that came with power, the fragility of authority when it was no longer backed by respect. He had learned, too, that true strength came from within, not from the titles one wore or the commands one issued. Maddox had embodied that strength in a way that left a lasting impression on him. He found himself reflecting more often on the subtle truths she had demonstrated, especially in the face of adversity. But while the base had moved on, there were still some who could not forget what had happened. A few lingering doubts remained in the minds of some officers, particularly those who had been loyal to the generals. They whispered quietly among themselves, not understanding the full scope of the events that had unfolded. For them, the general's downfall was something of a betrayal, something that left a scar on the traditions they had upheld for so long. But those whispers faded in the face of Maddox's continued composure. She did not need to defend herself. The record was clear. She had nothing to prove. As time passed, even those who had once harbored resentment or doubt began to acknowledge the truth. The generals had acted recklessly, and Maddox had faced them with an unshakable resolve. The respect she had earned was not given out of pity or fear, but out of the undeniable understanding that she had stood firm when it mattered most. One evening, as Maddox prepared for another debriefing, she received a message from the command center. It was not unexpected. A new assignment was waiting for her. Another mission, another responsibility. She was not one to shy away from challenges, but she also knew that the path ahead would never be as simple as following orders. The events at Quantico had proven that. They had reminded her that power was not something to be taken lightly. The military had its codes, its procedures, but there was always room for personal integrity. Maddox had proven that one could navigate those systems without sacrificing one's soul. She read the message carefully, her mind already considering the next steps, the details that needed attention. The work was never done, and Maddox was always prepared to face the next challenge head-on. But as she closed her laptop and prepared to leave her office, she paused for a moment. She had earned her place, not by conforming to expectations, but by standing true to her values. And no matter where her next assignment would take her, that truth would always be her guide. As she walked down the hallway, the hum of activity around her seemed quieter than before. The base was still busy, still filled with the constant rhythm of military life, but for Maddox it had become a familiar background. She was ready for whatever came next. She had already faced the hardest battle, the one within herself, and in that battle she had emerged victorious. The news of Maddox's next assignment came without ceremony. There was no fanfare, no grand celebration. That was not her way. But for those who had watched her rise, it was clear. She had become a symbol, not of defiance, but of discipline and resilience. The mission itself, a complex and highly classified operation, was far from ordinary. It required someone with not only the operational experience, but also the moral clarity to make difficult decisions in high-pressure situations. For Maddox, it was just another challenge, another opportunity to prove that her strength lay not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, unwavering consistency of her character. As she prepared for the new assignment, her colleagues seemed to shift around her, as if waiting for her to give the signal that they too could move forward. Maddox had become an unspoken anchor for many, a touchstone for those who had witnessed the unraveling of the generals and who now needed a reminder of what true leadership looked like. Captain Thier, in particular, found himself reflecting on his own role within the military. He had always been competent, always done his job, but now he found himself questioning the very nature of authority. He had watched Maddox, a woman who had been marginalized and underestimated, not only withstand, but ultimately transcend the challenges thrown at her. It was a powerful lesson, one he would carry with him. The quiet humility in which Maddox had handled the entire ordeal spoke volumes. She had been the one to rise above the chaos, not by reacting to it, but by maintaining her focus and her integrity. In many ways, Thier realized, Maddox was not just a reflection of the military at its best. She was a challenge to it, an embodiment of what the institution could be if it embraced the values it so often professed to uphold. But as Maddox prepared for her next mission, she did so with the same calm determination she had shown all along. She knew that the military was a place of rules, regulations, and hierarchy, but she also understood that those structures were not invulnerable. She had seen firsthand how quickly they could break down under the weight of arrogance and abuse. Maddox's continued resolve, her ability to maintain her integrity in the face of such challenges, had left an indelible mark on everyone around her. And though the military system would continue to function, as it always had, something within it had shifted. The general's downfall had been a catalyst, but Maddox had been the one to show the way forward. For her, the new assignment was just another chapter in her ongoing story, a story that was not about power, but about the quiet strength of remaining true to one's values, regardless of the consequences. As she walked into the briefing room for the mission, she felt the familiar weight of expectation. It was not the kind of expectation that demanded her to perform for others, but the kind that came from within. Maddox had long ago understood that the only person she needed to prove herself to was herself. The mission was dangerous, complex, and filled with uncertainty. But Maddox was not intimidated. She had already faced the greatest test of her life, and she had emerged unbroken. Now all that remained was to complete the task ahead, to uphold the values she had fought so hard to preserve. And so, with quiet determination, Maddox stepped into the next phase of her journey, knowing that the road ahead would be just as uncertain as the one she had already traveled. But one thing was certain: she would face it with the same unyielding resolve that had carried her through the darkest moments of her career. The battle for integrity was never truly over, but Maddox was prepared to fight it, one quiet victory at a time. As Maddox boarded the aircraft that would take her to the next assignment, she felt a quiet sense of resolve settle over her. This mission, like all the others before it, would not be defined by its outcome, but by the manner in which she carried herself through it. She knew that there would be dangers ahead, unforeseen challenges that would test not only her physical abilities, but her mental fortitude. But none of that mattered. What mattered was staying true to the path she had set for herself. The base had changed in subtle ways since her quiet confrontation with the generals. The officers who had once ignored her or doubted her now sought her guidance. The respect she had earned was not given because of her rank or her title, but because of her unflinching adherence to a code that had proven itself time and again. In the quiet corners of the base, where whispers about the generals still circulated, Maddox had become a touchstone for those who sought to understand what real strength looked like. It wasn't in the loud declarations or grand gestures, it was in the silent, unwavering consistency of action, day in and day out. As she looked out the window of the plane, the world beneath her sprawling out in quiet beauty, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had faced challenges that most could never imagine, had stood against powerful men, and had come out on the other side with her dignity intact. The path had not been easy, and it had often been lonely, but it had always been hers to walk. The military was a place of structure, of rules and regulations, and in many ways it was an unforgiving world. But Maddox had learned that the most important thing was not to bend to the pressures of the system, but to navigate it on her own terms. The generals had learned this lesson too late. Hall and Markham had believed that their power was enough to crush her, to make her fold under their authority. They had underestimated her, and that had been their downfall, but Maddox had never sought to prove them wrong. She had simply been herself, never compromising her principles, never straying from the quiet path of integrity. As the plane soared through the sky, the mission details ahead were clear in her mind, but it was the people she had left behind who lingered in her thoughts. The young officers, the staff, the colleagues who had come to understand what it meant to be a true leader. In them, Maddox saw the future. It was in their hands now, not the hands of generals who had failed to understand the weight of responsibility. And in their hands the lessons of the past would not be forgotten. The world was changing, and though the military would always be a place of order and command, the nature of leadership was evolving. No longer was it about commanding with force or maintaining an image of power. It was about integrity, discipline, and the quiet strength that came from knowing who you were, regardless of the world around you. Maddox didn't need to shout to be heard. She had learned that silence, when used with purpose, spoke louder than any words ever could. The plane began its descent, and Maddox prepared herself for what awaited on the ground. The mission was important, but it was just another part of her journey. She would face it with the same quiet resolve that had brought her to this point. The mission would be completed, the truth would be upheld, and no matter where she went, she would always remain the same. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she knew this. The lesson of the past had already been learned. And as long as she walked the path of integrity, she would never be lost. The days on the ground felt like a blur. The mission was complex, involving multiple agencies, and each step forward required precision and careful planning. Maddox's role was clear, but as always, she focused not on the outcome, but on the process, the small, deliberate steps that added up to something greater. Her team respected her, not just for her operational expertise, but for the calm assurance she carried with her. They knew she wouldn't flinch when the pressure mounted, that she would be the constant in the chaos. It was a quality that had earned her the trust of her subordinates and the cautious respect of her superiors. Maddox was never the one to seek out the spotlight, but it always seemed to find her, not because of her actions in the field, but because of the way she carried herself. She had a way of making everyone around her feel like their role mattered, that every action, no matter how small, was part of a larger mission. On this assignment, she once again found herself in a position where the weight of the mission rested squarely on her shoulders. But even as the pressure built, she remained unfazed. She did not believe in dramatic heroism. She believed in discipline, in following the plan, and in trusting her instincts. Every mission was a test of her ability to stay true to those principles. The operation, like so many before it, went smoothly, but it was the quiet moments, the ones between the actions, that left a lasting impression on those who worked with her. They saw the consistency in her, the way she could remain calm under fire, the way she kept her team focused on the mission, without letting the weight of the situation distract them. In the debriefing afterward, her role was not highlighted with grand praise. Instead, it was the quiet recognition from her peers, the acknowledgement that she had done exactly what was needed, without hesitation, without overreaction. It was a simple debrief, but it carried with it the weight of respect. Maddox had become a fixture in her field, not for the accolades she had received, but for the respect she had earned. She was no longer just a woman in a male-dominated field. She was a leader, a force to be reckoned with in her own right. The journey that had begun with a slap, with accusations and doubts, had led her here, to this moment where her role was unquestioned. And yet, she remained as humble as ever. She never sought to be above her peers, never sought to be anything more than what she had always been, a woman who followed her principles, who adhered to the quiet strength of her values, and who did her job with the utmost professionalism. The mission ended without fanfare, as most of them did. There were no medals, no public recognition, but for Maddox, that was exactly how she wanted it. She did not need validation from others. The validation had already been given to her long ago through the simple act of standing firm in the face of adversity. As she boarded the plane to return to base, Maddox reflected on the journey she had taken. She had faced the generals who tried to break her, had faced an institution that didn't always understand her, and yet she had never wavered. The military as an institution had been tested, but it was she who had emerged unscathed. It had not been a matter of victory, but of survival. And she had survived not because she was the strongest, but because she had been the most consistent. In the end, it was the quiet victories that mattered most. As Maddox returned to base, the familiar sights of Quantico greeted her. The quiet buzz of activity, the routine movements of officers, and the ever-present hum of military life. But something had shifted since she had left for her mission. The whispers had subsided, the rumors had faded, but the respect she had earned had only grown. No one spoke of her directly, not in the open, but there was a sense that things had changed, that her place in the fabric of the military was secure in a way it had never been before. The generals, once towering figures of authority, were now a footnote in history, their careers dismantled by their own arrogance. Maddox, on the other hand, had quietly reclaimed her position as a leader, not by power or manipulation, but by sheer determination and unwavering principles. The way forward was always clear to her. Every mission, every assignment was a chance to prove that strength came from discipline, from following the path laid before you, even when the world tried to force you to bend. She never saw herself as a hero, nor did she care to be viewed as one. She was simply a soldier, a woman in a world that didn't always understand her, but a woman who had found her place nonetheless. As she walked the halls of the base, her colleagues nodded to her in acknowledgement, a silent recognition of the unspoken lessons she had taught them. No one expected her to explain herself. They had already seen who she was. In the months that followed, Maddox continued to serve with the same quiet dignity she always had. She took on new roles, faced new challenges, but nothing ever seemed to shake her resolve. It wasn't about titles or accolades. It was about doing the work, doing it well, and doing it with integrity. For the officers and soldiers who worked with her, that was enough. They saw the kind of leadership that didn't need to be displayed in grand gestures, but in the small, everyday acts of professionalism and commitment. For some, Maddox had become a model of what the military could be if it embraced the values it so often claimed to uphold. It was not about power. It was not about dominance. It was about discipline, consistency, and the quiet strength that came from knowing who you were and never compromising that truth. The challenges Maddox had faced in the past were now behind her, but they had shaped her into the woman she was today. The slap, the accusations, the power struggle, they had all been tests, and she had passed them all, not by fighting back, but by remaining steadfast in her belief that what she was doing was right. The military would continue on, as it always had, but Maddox knew that she had already made her mark. She had carved a space for herself, not by breaking the rules, but by adhering to them in a way that made the system respect her rather than control her. And that, she realized, was the greatest victory of all. As she walked back to her office, the weight of the past seemed to lift off her shoulders. She had done the work. She had faced the adversity. And now, all that remained was to continue down the path she had set for herself. It was a path of quiet strength, of integrity, and of unwavering resolve. And no matter what the future held, she knew she would walk it with her head held high. Maddox stood in the quiet of her office, gazing out over the base. The world outside was familiar, but her perspective had changed. The battles she had fought, both visible and unseen, had shaped her in ways she had yet to fully comprehend. What was clear now, however, was that she had earned something more valuable than any accolade, more enduring than any rank. She had earned the kind of respect that could not be shaken by any single event, no matter how monumental. The military was a world of rigid rules, of hierarchy and authority. But in the end, Maddox had learned that the true measure of a leader wasn't found in their position, but in their character. The generals who had once mocked her, who had sought to undermine her, had underestimated her in ways they could never have imagined. They had thought power was something to be wielded and forced upon others, but Maddox had proven them wrong. Power, she had learned, was not something to be taken. It was something that was earned, something that could only come from unwavering discipline and commitment to the truth. The room behind her door was filled with the hum of the usual base activity, but today it felt different. No one needed to acknowledge her. No one needed to give her the credit. The quiet strength of her resolve had already done that for her. As she stood there, reflecting on everything she had overcome, there was no sense of triumph, no smug satisfaction. What Maddox had learned was that true victory wasn't in winning a battle, but in remaining unbroken in the face of adversity. She had won not by defeating anyone else, but by overcoming the hardest challenge of all, staying true to herself, no matter the cost. Outside, the sounds of the base continued, life carrying on as it always did. But for Maddox, there was a deeper understanding now. The fight she had been a part of was over, and she had emerged from it with her integrity intact, her character stronger than ever. And as she prepared for whatever the next challenge might be, she knew one thing for certain. The truth, when it was upheld with unwavering strength, would always be the most powerful weapon in the room. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. The record had already been written, and that was enough. Jeśli ta historia poruszyła Cię emocjonalnie, zasubskrybuj nasz kanał, podziel się swoją opinią w komentarzach i udostępnij ten film innym.